You are someone who looks very much at future of the media, how it can be solved, also kind of working within CNN. What's that like?
Well, I certainly went through this media ringer, and I appreciate you and Crystal and folks like Joe and Sam Harris and so many others, Breakfast Club, that had me on when I was not as mainstream, I suppose, and just heard me out and talked about my campaign. Now being on CNN, like I have more insight into the goods and bads of how the media works. And I've been honest saying, look, for me, being on CNN, I think is very positive because it helps just get my face and voice in front of Americans in a way that can help advance our goals and ideas. And I will say, being on CNN, I have never gotten any notes in terms of, hey, maybe you should try and make this point, or feedback being like, hey, that point was not great,
Right.
or go down this direction. So, on that level, it's quite positive. But I also see that there are incentives wrapped up in the medium that end up driving coverage in particular ways, and that the medium doesn't allow for particular types of conversations or ideas to get out that might not fit into the rhythm of a 5-minute cable news hit that in those news hits comprise the vast majority of the coverage, because the thought is that, well, if you're a TV audience, like you need to keep things snappy and then kind of get in and out, and maybe have like graphic and video and some other stuff. So I let's just say that, being part of the media is just fueling my desire to try to change the incentives in ways that'll make it work better for more Americans. And I say this in particular about the 1,000+ local newspapers that went out of business. So are there issues with cable news? Yes, major issues. But at least they exist. If you have no local paper, it's very hard to vote on what's going on in your town. And so what's going on in media is a microcosm of what is going wrong in American life, which is just the market runs everything. And so if you're like, post office doesn't make money, fuck the post office, that local paper didn't make money anymore, get rid of it. It's like, well, maybe that local paper actually had some value to the people in that town beyond the fact that it made money as a private concern. To me, we have to fix democracy, and it's going to be difficult to fix democracy if you don't have certain types of functioning media organizations.
Yeah, and let's talk about the incentives there, because we've talked a lot here on my podcast just about the way that the media business is changing. You had the click ad revenue model. Of course, there was a monopoly on classified ads. Now that's gone with Facebook, Google, and so much more. I actually use a line all the time that I think you said on my show, which is that the internet naturally selects for monopolies. Like nobody wants to use the fourth worst Google, the second best Facebook, or whatever. But if we're going to live within that system with realities, and I've always appreciated that, you're fair, right? That, people don't really want to use multiple Facebooks or multiple Googles. If we're going to live in that world, what do we do with media? So, because how do we actually make it so, because you don't want government subsidized local news either. I mean, that, we're talking about earmarks and pork. Like,
I actually do want, and this is where we disagree, I want government subsidized local news.
Yeah, but how would you protect it? How would you protect it from, legislators who are using it as a bargaining chip? Like if you look at what's happening right now with Voice of America and the Global News Agency, there have been all these accusations like, oh, Trump put in this person, and even though this person has been selected by Congress. So if we were going to fund it, like what are the ways that we could do it while keeping it independent with the essential role that media has, and then also protecting it from political influence? Is it even possible?
I think it is possible. And I think that there are a few different parties that need to be part of it. Number one is government. Number two is nonprofits and NGOs. And then number three are the media companies. And I think there's a way you can fund it where, let's say, hypothetically, you said, guess what? Getting quality information about what's going on in your community is a public good. And we're just going to say that there's a certain amount of money that gets allocated for every congressional district based on population, and there's going to be like a local paper that ends up being the beneficiary of this, or like a local station, or whatever like the local organs are. And it could be public, private, it could even be in some cases philanthropic, but that there are different approaches. These media organizations could 100% exist if they weren't forced to throw off market level profits every given quarter. So what do I mean by that? It's like, look, my local paper can't compete. But if you had a combination public-private and you had a paper that made a certain amount of money and then spent that much money on coverage and it broke even every year, obviously no one would invest in that because, it's a terrible business. But as the public, would you invest in that? Probably. I mean, you'd put it in place, and then at least you don't have to and in my mind, it would be worth the subsidy. I have no problem with subsidizing local journalism. And I also think, Saagar, this is a fundamental issue. And this is where and I think I'm clear-headed about this, genuinely. This is probably where you and I disagree. Conservatives look up and say, hey, you can't have government involved with local media because it'll become politicized and a bargaining chip, and they might influence coverage, et cetera, et cetera. And then I look at it and say, okay, the current situation is literally zero. like, can you improve on zero? And if you have issues around politicization and the rest of it, you can look around the world and say, look, are there independent media organizations that are publicly funded that seem like they're okay criticizing the government? And you would find, yes, they do exist. You could hold up the BBC as one potential example and say that, is it perfect? No, but does it exist? And do a lot of people get value from it? And like, does it seem fairly independent journalistically and able to critique leaders? Yeah, sure. And so the correct approach is not, in my opinion, just throw up your hands and say, can't do it, like government's going to screw it up somehow. Instead, you have to get into the weeds of it and say, look, like the current path is leading towards, in this case, total absence of local journalism, which I would argue is very disastrous for democracy. So then you have to just put your hard hat on and roll up your sleeves and say, okay, what are the issues we're concerned about? You don't want politicians being able to yank funding every time that the news organization says something nasty about them. Well, then, let's see if we can make this funding mechanism independent of Congress's whims. Maybe you have very long time frames, or you can only make changes X years in advance when it might not matter to you anyway.
Right.
So that to me is a more principled approach. And this is the tough truth as someone who, and it's fun because I know some people like me because they think I have some libertarian impulses and leanings and whatnot. I am very conscious of the fact that there are a lot of things, in my opinion, government is terrible at, and you'd rather not have them involved with it. But there's also this tough truth that we're in an era where you're going to need government at a minimum to inject resources into certain types of institutions or to solve certain types of problems, because there's so many problems we have that the market will not have any interest in solving.
So I actually completely agree with you. And, people, who know me know that it's not about the government intervention necessarily that I'm most concerned about. It's actually that I'm not so sure that we don't have a private sector solution. And the reason I say that is because I look at somebody like you who was born, like I said, with the Joe Rogan of the internet. I see this burgeoning alternative media ecosystem. I see Substack. I see what's happening in Silicon Valley with tech and so much more, the explosion of new businesses and more. And I say, you know what? There's something going on here. There's a realignment, so to speak, right? You have changing business, changing media landscape, changing business landscape. You have changing political coalitions. It's like the craziest election in a long, maybe crazier than the one before that. So I kind of apply it as a framework towards everything. And that's what I mean when I say I look at the media, and I know you're involved in the tech space as well. I see this explosion of Substack. I see this explosion of independent journalists, guys like Matt Taibbi, Joe Rogan going to Spotify, the emergence of this whole new culture. And I'm like, what it's really up to is entrepreneurs and others is to find a way in order to make that work for local news. And if that actually cannot work, if we truly cannot work, I'm not above the public solution whatsoever. It's more about jumping towards that a little bit too quickly, if that makes sense.
It can't work, brother. The numbers guy has looked at it and said, this is a total disaster. And when companies have invested tens of millions in it. You remember Patch?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
You know, like it was just setting money on fire. The local papers have all become, desiccated husks or disappeared. And I walked through those offices because I was campaigning in rural Iowa and New Hampshire and elsewhere. And so you go interview with a local paper, and guess what that office looks like now? It's half empty, and people are looking around wondering if they're going to survive. And that's pre-pandemic. I mean, post-pandemic, the stuff's even worse. Can you imagine being like a free weekly in Austin or Boston or wherever trying to survive now? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Like I'm sure that there is no entrepreneurial market-based solution for local journalism, unless you were to have something like universal basic income, where people had their needs met, and then if they wanted to, they could write about stuff. But even then, you would have certain types of journalism that were not included in that, because like a local blog is not the same as having a genuine news organization. Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.